Welcome to episode 6 of Back to Beverly, and thanks for tuning in. I'd like to thank my guest on this episode, Alex Tourk, for taking the time out of his busy schedule to join me for my first virtual interview. Alex was kind enough to respond almost immediately to my initial outreach and was glad to relive his high school days, sharing with me before we started recording that some of his best friends at Beverly are still good friends of his to this day. We discussed his beginnings in California politics, his work with well-known politicians including San Francisco mayors Willie Brown and Gavin Newsom, and his transition into private practice with the founding of his firm, Ground Floor Public Affairs, which just celebrated 15 years in business and has made Alex one of the biggest power brokers in San Francisco politics today. With that said, here's my interview with Alex Tourk. I hope you enjoy. Alex, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, Dillon. I appreciate it.
So we're recording this podcast virtually, or else my first question for you would be about being back on campus. But how does it feel to be reminiscing about the high school days? Do you look fondly on your years at Beverly?
Oh, yeah, by all means. Certainly love the experience. Love growing up in Los Angeles. I'm from New York originally, but we moved out when I was about 7. So again, loved growing up, going to Horace Mann before Beverly. I have a lot of great memories by all means. I still have, a couple of really close friends from those days who I still see from time to time. So I was, kind of touched to get your invitation. I appreciate it.
Cool. Do are there any thoughts looking back on your days at Beverly, what you think made it such a great institution?
Well, I guess there was something for everybody. That's kind of how I remember it. I mean, I was very heavy on the extracurricular activities. So, played sports, played water polo and baseball. I happened to be, in a band, and I was in madrigals and wrote for the newspaper and, just did a lot of different things. And there were a lot of different kind of groups of people. So I felt like there were just, a lot of different ways to kind of express who you were, try new things. And I certainly just have very positive experience of it.
Where the heck did you find all the time to fit all that in? I feel like I played golf and I was on KBEV and I felt like I had a full schedule.
Well, I probably should have been studying more.
Yeah, right.
Is the reality, but but somehow I made it through okay.
So obviously I mentioned in the intro, you've had quite a successful career in San Francisco politics. Did you have an inkling while you were at Beverly that this is a career path you wanted to pursue? And were you involved in student government? I mean, you mentioned all the other clickers, but were you involved in ASB at all?
I wasn't actually. I mean, I was at Horace Mann, but didn't transfer over to high school. Actually, the interest in public service and history and politics really came from my mom. She was a co-founder of the Hollywood Women's Political Committee, and back in 92, was part of what was then considered the Year of the Woman, where Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein and Carol Moseley Braun and Patty Murray were all elected to the Senate. And I just remember meetings in my living room when I was, 10, 11, 12 years old. So I think that had an impact in me. I became a history major at Boston University. But yeah, I thought I was actually going to be a teacher, to be quite honest. But things take different turns,
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned a little bit ago, part of your extracurriculars, you were involved in the madrigals at Beverly, which for those listening is a pretty legendary program, once headed up by the late great Joel Pressman. What can you share a little bit about that experience, learning from him yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my older sister was in madrigals, so she was 3 years older than me. So I'm sure I never would have done it without my sister.
Okay.
And believe me, my friends gave me a lot of ribbing for it, but I loved it. I really did. It had a very, very positive impact on my life, and Mr. Pressman was a big part of that. I think, when you're a teenager and you're dealing with hormones and you're trying to figure things out. And I grew up with a single mom, so I didn't really have, kind of a father figure in my life. He definitely would, he'd put his foot down with me and expected the best of me. And it made me a better person, to be honest. And how seriously he took the craft, right, of musicianship. And yeah, no, I learned a lot about what I was capable of, I think, as a young man. And it was just a really rewarding experience, definitely.
Were outside of Mr. Pressman, obviously you mentioned he was kind of like a mentor to you. Were there any other teachers that come to mind at Beverly that sort of influenced you and your life today?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about influencing my life per se. Um, Miss Richards, I believe her name was a math teacher. She definitely played an important role in my academic life, definitely. But yeah, no, I mean, I think I remember more of the students and the activities and just kind of where I was in life, versus any specific teacher or coach.
Normal teenager stuff then.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Boston University. Obviously, you graduate Beverly and you go about as far away as possible to the Northeast there. Was there something that drew you to New England? Similarly, I ended up in New England at UMass, so not far from Boston. And I'd always get the question, what the heck are you doing here if you grew up in LA? I'm curious if you got a lot of that and sort of drew you to that part of the country.
Definitely, but it was kind of to my benefit.
Yeah.
We were a rare breed, the Californians on the East Coast. But as I said before, I'm from New York originally, so the majority of my family was still back east. My sister, again, 3 years ahead of me, went to Brandeis, so I got a chance to visit Boston, and I think I was just ready for change, to be quite honest, and just something different. I think I always knew I was going to get back to California. I actually fell in love with San Francisco when I was a teenager. So I just thought no matter where I went for college, for some reason, I knew the grand plan. Not that I knew what I was going to do or how I was going to do it, but I was going to get to San Francisco some way, somehow.
Yeah, and to your point, it's interesting the different generations. My first guest I interviewed, and we were chatting before, and he was saying, the generation that graduated Beverly in the 70s, they'd applied to UCLA, USC, and maybe Berkeley. And I feel like as the time went on, people were more willing to explore and get out of LA. And now, me and my friend group, I don't think anybody stuck around, right? So it's just interesting to watch the evolution. Yeah. Did you have any interest staying back east after? Well, you sort of mentioned you want to get back to California, but was there?
No,
Yeah.
no, I definitely. I mean, again, I loved Boston, and in fact, my son, who is a senior in high school, just got into Emerson College, so he's going to be going back to Boston as well, and taking him back there. I hadn't been back there in like 25 years. But it's a beautiful city, and there's just students everywhere and just so many different opportunities for different things. And again, I keep trying to convince my son, him being, he's like that quintessential California skateboarder. So I think he's going to do real well.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. Congratulations on that. So you, after college, you sort of begin your political career on the staff of a pretty legendary California Assemblyman, Lou Pappin. How did that come about? Can you talk to us a little bit about that and the ins and outs? How much from working with him?
No, absolutely. I mean, it took me a little bit of time to get there. As I said before, I thought I wanted to be a teacher, but now looking back, I think I just wanted to know that I had a plan to get to San Francisco. So I applied to grad school to get my teaching credential at St. Mary's. So that brought me up to the Bay Area. But after 1 year, and I did very well. It's just looking around the room and seeing people that wanted to be a teacher for the next 50 years. And I was only 22 years old. It just, it seemed like something I wasn't ready to commit to with that kind of passion. And as I said before, I've always had a passion for public service and history. I was a history major. So I actually ended up volunteering on some campaigns, and that's really where it hit me. I kind of use the analogy of a political campaign to being in a Broadway play. You rehearse and you love each other one day and you hate each other the next. And it all leads to showtime, right? Which is election day, essentially. And either you get the New York Times review and you're a big hit and you win, or you're a flop and you lose. And there was this intoxicating energy to that just became infectious. So volunteering led to a campaign position, led to me meeting Lou, who was an incredible mentor, both professionally and personally.
And was it in that capacity that working for him sort of snowballed and led you to other political figures in the San Francisco ranks?
Yeah, absolutely. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and the Assemblyman's District was the district just south of the city, around where the airport is, or what we call the peninsula here in the Bay Area. So I really got to cut my teeth, but he had worked with Willie Brown when he was speaker, and he was then mayor of San Francisco. So they still had a very close relationship. And after working with the Assemblyman for 6 years, I kind of really wanted to be like in the big time, in the big city. And I was nervous as all hell, but I went, and we had such a good relationship that I told him that this was what I wanted to do. And while he was obviously disappointed because we had a great relationship, he literally picked up the phone and called Mayor Brown, and within 3 weeks I had a job. So I'm very grateful to Lou in many, many ways.
Yeah. How was it working for Lou on the state level versus working for Willie in San Francisco? I mean, you mentioned big time. Was it a bigger role or bigger deal to be working at that point in San Francisco city politics versus on the state level?
Oh, absolutely. Well, again, I was the district director for the Assemblyman. So I wasn't in Sacramento. I was the guy running the office in the district and dealing with all the constituent service work and going to all the events and things of that nature. So yeah, working in the city was way more demanding, intense. The battles were raw, but it was a great training ground for where I am today.
When you were working for Willie Brown when he was the mayor of San Francisco, did you have, I think at that point, Kamala Harris was sort of on her way up through the political ranks and they had a close relationship. Did you have dealings with her at that time?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting story. So in 2000, I was asked by then the Democratic Party chair of California to run the San Francisco coordinated campaign for Al Gore.
Wow.
And I remember when Mayor Brown called me into his office to say that he had just gotten this call from the party chair asking if I would, run the Gore campaign in San Francisco. And I said, well, are you asking me, sir, or are you telling me?
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm asking, honestly, like it might be a great opportunity for you. And I was like, wait, isn't Al Gore going to get like 90% of the vote in San Francisco? Like, I don't know. He's like, again, I mean, the guy called me, if you want to take this opportunity, take it. And I did. And it was a great experience. And I remember coming in the day after the election, and his assistant asked me to be there at 9 a.m. sharp. And I literally thought, I was like, wow, he's calling to congratulate me. That's really amazing. And I came in and he wanted nothing to talk about the Gore campaign. There were a bunch of local supervisorial campaigns, and most of his candidates were losing and going into, from the primary to the general. So there was a 5-week runoff, and he said, yeah, I'm going to send my 2 best operatives out to the most southeastern part of San Francisco to shore up his candidate. And he said, I'm sending you and Kamala Harris. And I didn't really know Kamala at that time, but we sure got to know each other really well. We worked, 5 weeks in a row, 14, 16-hour days. And we remained close ever since. But obviously, as she continued to rise, our interactions became a little less frequent. Sure. But we certainly connected when she was running for president. And, she's very kind to my son, and she's a wonderful person. We should all be quite proud of who she is and where she is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, things in your life that I don't know that you would have guessed that in 2000 working with her that she'd be 20 years later the vice president of the United States. But it's kind of cool. So you mentioned you're still sort of in touch with her. Are you ever in touch with her work-wise, or is it more personal at this point? Do you ever need to work on a national scale with your clients, or is it more?
Yeah, I mean, look, to be honest, and I remember saying this to my mom when she became vice president, I was like, wow, like I have the vice president's cell phone. Like, that's really impressive. And she's like, no, you don't. She's like, that cell phone is gone. Like, you have no idea. So to be honest, like since she became vice president, I haven't talked to her once. Now I talk to her staff and her political folks, from time to time. And yeah, there are times we have issues that intersect every once in a while with the federal government, but not very often. And, I'm more of a Bay Area centric, California centric firm. But, again, I'm sure the time will come around re-election time and fundraising time and, things of that nature. But But again, she's fantastic.
Well, I'd like to think that you still have the cell phone, so let's. So obviously, Ground Floor Public Relations is the firm that you founded after a long stint in the public sector. What prompted you in the transition from public life to the private corporate world? Was there something in particular? And I will say we're recording this shortly after your 15th anniversary of Ground Floor, so congratulations on that. To add on to that, where do you see the firm in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think when you're a political operative, both on the campaign side and in the government, you spend so much time representing the principal, right? Like everything you do is around your boss, right? And moving the ball on one policy or one campaign or one initiative. And I think I just got to a point where I was a little tired of being the guy behind the guy. And I'm a big believer in kind of cross-sector collaboration that, government can do a lot, but it really needs to be working more closely with the private sector and the nonprofit sector and just the broader community. And because of my campaign work, I really felt like I had the leadership skills and organizational skills to be successful. And I think a lot of people in government could do what I do, but it's a risk, right? I mean, you're not being paid by the taxpayer. I got to go, earn my own clients and find my own work. But I must say, I never saw myself as an entrepreneur. I thought I was going to work for a mayor and then a governor and then a president, and that was my trajectory. But now looking back, I'm so grateful that I made the decision I did, because I have a wonderful team of 10 that works with and for me. We have 30 really diverse clients working on really interesting issues, and every day is different. And I haven't found myself literally once in 15 years waking up and saying, oh man, I got to go to work today. Like I feel so fortunate and lucky to do what I do.
That's amazing. So I guess my next question was going to be, do you see yourself still in the business over the next 10, 15 years? But it sounds like you loving what you do means that you'll probably still be around.
Oh yeah. I mean, I consider myself a relatively young man at 51. Again, my kid's about to go to college, so I'm going to be an empty nester, which is a little hard to believe. And I got a lot of energy. And I kind of feel like we're just getting started. So yeah, there's no reason in the next 10, 15, 20 years, to be honest. I'd really like to continue to expand throughout California, maybe even get further into the LA market, where I still obviously have a ton of relationships, as well as Sacramento. California is the 5th largest economy on the planet. And I think with our, 15 years of relationships and record of accomplishment, that we could grow and be more significant throughout the state.
You mentioned briefly the risk of going out on your own. Was it a frightening? Well, I mean, you obviously made the decision. Was it frightening then to sort of say, hey, I'm going to leave this paying job and working for these high profile politicians to now go out on my own?
Yeah, I mean, it was risky, right? But I had good people around me that wanted to support me and gave me guidance and direction. And, I found that, it's a little bit of a crawl before you walk. That if I was able to, at least I got great advice, that if I was able to cobble 3 clients together, get a business license, get a logo, get a website, get an office, that before you know it, you've got enough to, kind of get off the ground, right? And I've certainly learned a lot about systems and process along the way. But I'm really glad that I pushed myself to take the risk, because it was well worth it.
Sort of like the famous line in Field of Dreams: if you build it, they will come. It sounds like you sort of built this business, and the clients have come over the years.
Yeah. A little bit. It's a good one.
So San Francisco politics are different from LA. Can you explain a little bit about the differences there, given that San Francisco has a unique structure and it being a consolidated governing body, wherein there's one council or is it a board of supervisors that sort of governs the city as well as the larger county?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a bunch of differences. I mean, one, LA is just so large, geographically. And you're right. The fact that you've got, the mayor of LA yet really with limited jurisdiction as all the resources are within the county. And there's just so many players in the space that I just think it gets kind of complicated. Again, not that I've worked inside of government in Los Angeles, but obviously I've worked with a bunch of elected officials and business and community leaders. But San Francisco is, man, that's the way to come up in politics. I mean, it is blood sport up here. It is, I think there are probably cities across the nation where you can, fight during the day and disagree and have a beer together at night. And San Francisco loves that us versus them, blood sport, like waking up an hour earlier and going to bed an hour later than your opponent. It's pretty intense up here, which, sometimes is exciting and sometimes can be a detriment that we get a little caught up in the politics and less about how do we just come together and solve problems.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's again, a great, if you can get ahead in San Francisco politics, there's a lot you could do.
We'll touch on that later. I guess, would you attribute that to why so many of the leaders in the Democratic Party today are from San Francisco politics, just because they're so, they've got their teeth and grinded.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you look at Pelosi, you look at Feinstein, you look at Gavin, you look at Kamala, Boxer. I mean, the list really goes on and on of leadership coming out of Northern California. So yeah, I certainly would equate it to that, definitely.
Yeah. So you touched a little bit about solving problems. Obviously, San Francisco faces a lot of the same issues Los Angeles does, including homelessness, affordable housing, violent crime, drugs, and etc. Does the single governing body in tandem with the mayor help or hurt solving those issues? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I would, it's a little of both. I mean, look, there's no simple solution to a complex problem. And I actually have a great passion for solutions to homelessness. Some of my background when I was deputy chief of staff to Gavin, when he was mayor of San Francisco, started a thing called Project Homeless Connect that became a national model. And while not a solution to homelessness per se, I think it was the first time, at least in San Francisco, then or since, that there's been a genuine portal to civic engagement on the issue. And I've stayed super connected to it, even through, ground floor. And I've represented a number of reputable agencies that are on the ground. But to be honest, sometimes that one body with that huge budget, it gets, we have a $14 billion budget in San Francisco. I mean, that's bigger than some states combined. And there's a lot of bureaucracy in that budget. So unfortunately, just because it's one entity doesn't necessarily mean it's more efficient.
Sure.
But it could be. It definitely could be.
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, hopefully it seems like the pandemic sort of made things worse. But hopefully that we're out of it, the politicians are sort of getting their stuff together to act quickly on it, because it's sad to go out on the streets here in LA. And I read stories about San Francisco too, where facing the same issues where people are living in squalor, and it's sad. But hopefully, like you said, there's no easy solution to a complex issue, but hopefully we're making strides in the right direction. Yeah. You've worked for a number of high profile politicians. Now you've sort of built a successful business. Do you have any public service ambitions of your own? I mean, you spent a good amount of time in the public sector and in the private. In my mind, perfect, sort of well-rounded candidate. Should we be expecting a run for the mayor?
From your mouth to my mother's ears, I think that would make her tremendously happy. But no, I don't have any political ambition, but I do have a lot of civic ambition. And in fact, I'm not sure when this is going to launch, Dillon, or when this is going to air. But I'm actually been working for over a year, and I'm going to launch in about a week to 10 days something called myownlockandkey.org, which is essentially an effort to build a citizen movement around a significant expansion of your transitional supportive housing, modular, tiny home construction. I'm a big believer that we can do that more efficiently. We can do that more affordably. And while people like to say in San Francisco that there's no land to do that, as we're a 49 square mile major metropolis, the reality is the city has everything it needs. It's got money, it's got parcels, it's got this innovative, affordable, efficient technology of modular, and we have a bevy of supportive services. What we lack is will. And I'm starting this effort in the hopes of really engaging the public to be involved in these solutions and welcome our unhoused neighbors into our communities.
It's very exciting, and I commend you for that work. Now, before I let you go, obviously it's been a great discussion, and I appreciate the time. Is there one piece of advice that you would share to the audience listening, something that you live by, or something that someone shared with you early on in your career?
Yeah, I mean, at least what I kind of put into my business, but now also into being a parent and into your personal life is kind of pick a couple things and do them really, really well. I see a lot of people, whether it's in business or in personal lives, try to do everything and push themselves to diversify and try all these things. And by the way, I certainly recommend trying all kinds of things. But in terms of like, once you've kind of figured out what you want to do, of picking those couple of things and making them the best they can be versus spreading it out and having a bunch of things be just kind of okay or mediocre. And, I guess that was advice I got a long time ago that I find me, kind of dipping into quite often.
It's an interesting piece of advice. It must be successful people that live by that, because Robert Herjavec, who's one of the sharks on Shark Tanks, actually I was at an event with him and he shared something similar, that people often get involved in so many things that they spread themselves too thin, as opposed to just finding something that they're really good at and sticking in that lane. So I appreciate that. And again, thank you so much for the time. This has been really great. I appreciate you sharing some fun stories, and hopefully you enjoyed a little trip back down memory lane, talking about Beverly days. And
oh no, by all means, thank you for doing what you're doing. Again, I was kind of touched to get the email, and I hope people find it interesting and educational. And I certainly hope you'll send me the link once it goes live.
Absolutely will. And hopefully next time I'm in San Francisco, or if you're down this way, we can grab a drink and catch up.
Right on. Awesome. I'd like that. Thank you for the time, Dillon. I appreciate it.
Thanks again, Alex. Talk soon.
You got it. Thanks so much.
Thanks again for listening. And just a reminder, if you enjoyed this interview, hit that subscribe button, leave me a review, and tell a friend. You can also find me on social at Back to Beverly on Instagram. Till next time, I'm your host, Dillon Curtis, signing off.
Did you press record?